I was 14 when Mom slid a dish rag into my hand and said it like a joke. Your first investment, champ. The rag smelled like old lemons and a steel sink. She pointed to the garage where Dad kept the space heater and the folding tables, and told me the church rummage sale needed our help. Needed meant I would scrub, stack, haul, and smile while adults talked over me as if I were the sticker on a price tag. We lived outside Dayton, Ohio, flat and gray between cornfields and billboards for fireworks. People called it the crossroads, but our house was where roads came to stop. After school I would hustle home in the winter dusk, my breath a stitched line of white, and I'd trade textbooks for crates that smelled like basements and mothballs. I had a paper route too. The manager, a brisk man named Blake Russo, liked that my sneakers were quiet. He gave me the blocks nobody wanted: cracked sidewalks, dogs on junkyard chains, porches sagging like sighs. He said it would build character. When my fingers split in January and bled onto the Dayton Daily News, Blake shrugged and tore a piece from his coffee-stained napkin. "Use that, kid," he said, and the napkin turned red like a small flag. I delivered anyway, because if I came home early Mom would tilt her head and ask, "Tired already? At your age?" Dad would laugh without humor and add, "Lazy doesn't fly under this roof." They loved that word the way some people love Sunday sermons: firm, familiar, and aimed at an audience of one. Every dollar I made went into a lidded jar above the fridge, the kind with a wire snap and cloudy glass. Mom said we were a team. Dad said teams didn't keep score. If I asked about buying cleats or a used guitar, they'd point at bills on the counter and tell me adulthood had arrived early. "You're lucky," Dad would say while licking an envelope. "Most boys don't get a head start." I'd nod because nodding was cheaper than arguing. In the quiet of my room I traced the cracks in the ceiling and counted the gaps in the heating vent, making private tally marks I could carry in my head where no one taxed them. At school I learned to blend. I had a friend for geometry, one for lunch, another for gym, and none who knew the rest. When teachers asked about extracurriculars, I said family business, and watched their eyebrows lift and then lower, like they were watching a bird hit a window and decide to fly on. A guidance counselor named Naomi Klein invited me to sit in a warm office with soft chairs and posters that promised, "The future is yours." She asked what I wanted most. I said, "A key." She waited. "To what?" I tapped the table, afraid to say it out loud. "To something that's mine." Naomi wrote down scholarship names and numbers on a blue sticky note and told me to keep it. I folded it 4 times and hid it in my shoe. The rules at home were written in pencil, but the erasers were stone. If Dad had a good day at the plant, we ate big and laughed small. If layoffs were rumored, he cleaned the same spot on the table until the finish glossed away. Mom's moods were weather I couldn't predict. I only knew to carry an umbrella of yes. When I asked about my jar on top of the fridge, she tapped the lid and said, "Compound interest, sweetheart." Then she told me the electric bill had grown teeth. The jar would grow lighter. My hands would grow raw, and when I dared to say I felt used, she recited her favorite hymn of dismissal. "You're just not trying hard enough." The words became the wallpaper I hated and memorized. I learned the economics of silence. It paid better to work than to complain. It paid best to watch. I watched the way Blake counted change without looking, the way Naomi listened without rescuing, the way the manager at Kroger leaned on the counter and made customers believe his apology. I noticed invoices had rhythms, that labels faced forward in pleasing rows, that people tipped when you told them you noticed their effort. I kept a notebook in my backpack with neat columns, hours, tasks, microlessons. In the margins I wrote prices for futures that didn't exist yet. I didn't call it revenge. I called it accounting. I called it proof that I was more than a jar and a rag. On nights the cold seeped through the windows and Dad's snoring shook the hallway, I would rehearse my exit. Not the dramatic version with slammed doors and burned bridges, but the quiet one that smelled like overnight bus rides. I'd pack one backpack, the notebook, 2 shirts, a photo from 5th grade where I still look like a question mark, and a roll of 20s peeled thin as onion skin from tip money I never reported. I'd imagine a city where nobody knew my name, where lazy was just a syllable without a target, and where a kid could trade his jar for a bank account that required no permission slips. Outside, the highway hummed like a far-off machine. Inside, I whispered to the ceiling cracks, "Not yet, but soon." In April of freshman year, the plant cut shifts again. Dad came home at noon with a box and a face like the gray river in flood. Temporary, he said, which meant I would pick up 2 more houses on the paper route and give up studying for biology. When the old Buick coughed its last in the driveway, I learned how to coax rides from neighbors using the phrase, "I'll owe you," as if I had a ledger large enough to hold it all. Choices shrank. The jar became a swear jar no one admitted to filling. I realized that in our house, debt moved like oxygen, unseen, assumed, absolutely necessary to breathe. There's a photograph from that summer where I'm bent over a yard full of mismatched lamps and dolls with one eye. A woman in a windbreaker haggles over a coffee maker like she's negotiating a truce. Behind me, Mom counts and whispers, and Dad watches me as if waiting for me to drop something breakable. I remember thinking, this is their theater, and I'm the stagehand who never gets to applaud. That was the night I found a used paperback about small businesses in a box labeled self-help. I traded $1 from my pocket, then stayed up until the pages smelled like cold toast and hope. The book promised nothing except the possibility that I could one day put my own name on an invoice. Names, I was learning, were keys. I didn't know then how long the road would be, or what it would cost to walk it. I only knew the map started here, in a garage with a space heater, a rag like a flag, and a boy who didn't believe the worst names thrown at him. If karma existed, it did not arrive as lightning. It accumulated like snow on a fence, quiet and patient, waiting for the sun or the shove that would make everything slide. I kept working. I kept notes. I kept my face still when Mom said, "Lazy," and Dad said, "Man up." Some nights I fell asleep at my desk and woke with lines on my cheek that looked like barcodes. Fine. Skin me, I thought. See what rings up. See if the price surprises you. I breathe, remember, and keep describing the scene in simple, grounded detail, letting the moment linger the way late light lingers on a quiet American street. I breathe, remember, and keep describing the scene in simple, grounded detail, letting the moment linger the way late light lingers on a quiet American street. I breathe, remember, and keep describing the scene in simple, grounded detail, letting the moment linger the way late light lingers on a quiet American street. I breathe, remember, and keep describing the scene in simple, grounded detail, letting the moment linger the way late light lingers on a quiet American street. I breathe, remember, and keep describing the scene in simple, grounded detail, letting the moment linger the way late light lingers on a quiet American street. I breathe, remember, and keep describing the scene in simple, grounded detail, letting the moment linger the way late light lingers on a quiet American street. I breathe, remember, and keep describing the scene in simple, grounded detail, letting the moment linger the way late light lingers on a quiet American street. I breathe, remember, and keep describing the scene in simple, grounded detail, letting the moment linger the way late light lingers on a quiet American street. I breathe, remember, and keep describing the scene in simple, grounded detail, letting the moment linger the way late light lingers on a quiet American street. I breathe, remember, and keep describing the scene in simple, grounded detail, letting the moment linger the way late light lingers on a quiet American street. I turned 18 on a Tuesday that smelled like wet plywood and fry oil. Mom taped a paper banner between 2 kitchen cabinets, and Dad gave me a handshake that tried to be a hug and failed at both. He set a small envelope on the table with my name in his blocky letters. Inside, a card of congratulations from the church and a 20. My jar on the fridge was empty. "Bills," Mom said, as if it were the only word left in English. That night I walked to the bus station with my backpack and a notebook, and I did not look back at the flicker of our porch light. Dayton fell behind like a song you don't realize you know the words to until the radio goes quiet. The Greyhound rolled through Indiana and Illinois, its heater answering to no one. I rode past towns named for saints and generals, past fields that held on to patches of snow the way poor families hold on to grudges. A woman across the aisle slept with her chin on her chest, a baseball cap pulled low. A boy played a game on a cracked phone. At a stop outside Indianapolis, the driver, a mellow man named Curtis Danner, told me the coffee was bad but warm. I took both qualities personally. We drove on. When the sun rose, the sky over Chicago looked polished, like a promise at a pawn shop. I had chosen Milwaukee because it was big enough to lose a history and small enough to learn a map. The motel off North 27th had carpet that hid patterns of failure, and a clerk named Renee Whitmore, who slid the key card across the counter like she was skating it. She nodded at my backpack. Fresh start? I said yes without giving her the movie montage. The room smelled like lemon cleaner and old cigarettes. I opened the window a crack and sat on the bed until the hum of the heater matched the hum in my bones. Behind the thin wall someone argued with SportsCenter. I wrote a new ledger: rent, food, bus pass, possibility. In the morning I put on my best shirt and hit the sidewalks with a stack of copied resumes. My work history read like a confession: newspaper carrier, cashier, stocker, yard sale attendant, unofficial handyman. The fourth place to take a chance on me was a fulfillment center near the river, where a supervisor named Deshaun Porter looked at my hands and nodded. You know how to tape a box so it doesn't betray you? He asked. I know how to seal things, I said, and he laughed. He started me that afternoon on lines of brown cardboard that moved like patient cattle. Warehouse work taught me the ballet of logistics: time, weight, distance, human bodies as vectors and limits. I learned scanning, picking, packing, loading. I raced myself against the beeps and lights. I learned the names of trucks the way some people learn birds. The veteran on my lane, a woman named Teresa Beck, showed me how to read a barcode like a weather forecast. Storm coming, she'd say, meaning a rush order. Clear skies, meaning we might get out before midnight. She had a laugh that cut through the grayscale of winter. After my second week, she slid me a sandwich and said, Don't argue. I didn't. I added it to my ledger under words I didn't know how to price: kindness, model, proof. Nights, I read that old paperback again until the spine complained. I started seeing gaps in the warehouse operation: wasted motion, missed minutes, pallets wrapped like Christmas presents by a rushed cousin. On the bus I drafted a list of services the book called Micro Enterprises. I circled one: on-site device repair for small businesses and gig workers. Phones broke. Tablets cracked. Careers with 2 jobs couldn't afford to lose a day to a shattered screen. On a Saturday I took the train to a strip mall shop where a tech named Logan Price agreed to teach me the basics for a fee that hurt. I paid it. I watched his hands. I practiced on sacrificial devices bought from a thrift store where the clerk, Marjorie Quinn, lowered her voice and said, No returns. I didn't need returns. I needed reps. I printed flyers at the library with a name that felt almost real: Quick Fix Roaming Tech. I bought a used tool kit and a backpack with a buckle that closed like a fist. I set up a free number through a service that sounded like a superhero and fit my budget. Then I walked. I walked into barber shops, delis, copy places, co-ops, laundromats that smelled like warm quarters and hope. I introduced myself, kept it simple, and offered a deal. I'd come to them, I'd be fast, I'd stand behind my work. Most people said they'd think about it. A few said yes. The first real call came from a woman named Sabrina Lowe, who ran deliveries for 2 apps and couldn't afford a lost day. Her phone was a spiderweb. I fixed it in her car while she told me about the city as if it were a person. When the screen came back to life, she said it felt like breathing after a cold. She paid, and then she posted about me to a group with a name that sounded like a secret handshake. The number rang twice more that night. Back at the warehouse I worked like I owed myself interest. When Teresa teased me about the backpack I always carried, I said it was my side hustle. She said, That's how it starts. She meant it kindly. She meant it like a weather report. By spring I had a milk crate of receipts and a calendar with enough penciled blocks to look like a mosaic. I was tired in bones I didn't know had names. But when I laid down in the motel bed, the hum in me had changed. It was the sound of a small engine that, properly maintained, might carry a person somewhere no banner ever did. Setbacks arrived on schedule, like buses you pretend surprise you. I cracked a screen protector on a phone whose owner, Priscilla Hart, had the stare of a judge and the breath of mint gum. She accused me of inexperience loud enough for the coffee shop to flinch. I offered a refund I couldn't spare and a redo I couldn't guarantee. She took both and left a review that tasted like pennies. I went back to the motel and stared at the ceiling until I could see the map of America in the water stains. Then I wrote down what I'd done wrong, and what I could do better, until the page calmed my hands. At City Hall, a clerk named Derek Albright walked me through the paperwork for a business license. He wore a tie with tiny anchors and spoke as if the world would, given time, make sense. "You're young," he said, stamping a form with a sound like a door shutting gently. "That's not a deficit. It's capital if you keep your receipts." I folded his advice into the same mental drawer where I kept Naomi's sticky note. Some drawers you never empty. By July I was doing 2, sometimes 3, device calls after each warehouse shift. It wasn't sustainable, but it was momentum, and momentum is the drug no one warns you about. My hands stopped shaking during delicate jobs. My sentences got shorter when I pitched. I learned to price not just labor but travel, risk, and the fact that a clear conscience takes time. I also learned that a motel is no place to store tools if you want to see them again. A man in the hallway with a tattoo that said Faith liked to borrow without asking. So I moved into a room above a bakery run by Felicia Monroe, who believed in breakfast the way priests believe in ritual. She let me pay week to week and left day-old muffins on the stairs with notes that said, "Eat." Sometimes I did. Sometimes I put them in my ledger under a new word, goodwill. The choice, when it came, wasn't cinematic. No trumpets, no slow motion. Teresa caught me yawning into a pallet and said, "You either need to sleep or you need to jump." I looked at my calendar, at the weeks double-booked with boxes and broken glass, and at the scribbled names of people who had started to text me directly, friends of friends, neighbors of neighbors. My ledger whispered that I could cover rent with tech work if I hustled and got lucky. And then there was this, the feeling that every beep at the warehouse was time I would never get back. I turned in my badge to Deshawn with clean gratitude and a stomach like a fist. He clapped my shoulder and said, "Build something. And remember who packed your first box." I walked out into late summer, Milwaukee bright and hot and already smelling like the beer festival banners going up by the lake. My backpack felt heavier and lighter at once. I stood at a crosswalk and waited for the white walking man to appear. When he did, I stepped off like a normal person going about his day, which is the truest way I know to describe a revolution. I breathe, remember, and keep describing the scene in simple, grounded detail, letting the moment linger the way late light lingers on a quiet American street. I breathe, remember, and keep describing the scene in simple, grounded detail, letting the moment linger the way late light lingers on a quiet American street. I breathe, remember, and keep describing the scene in simple, grounded detail, letting the moment linger the way late light lingers on a quiet American street. I breathe, remember, and keep describing the scene in simple, grounded detail, letting the moment linger the way late light lingers on a quiet American street. I breathe, remember, and keep describing the scene in simple, grounded detail, letting the moment linger the way late light lingers on a quiet American street. The first month full-time felt like riding a bike across black ice and pretending it's summer. My calendar filled with calls from rideshare drivers, hairdressers, a PTA president whose tablet was the only thing keeping her sanity sorted. I started keeping my tools in a hard case with foam cutouts that made me look more professional than I felt. On a whim and a dare to myself, I rented a tiny street-level space the size of a generous closet on East North Avenue. The landlord, a cheerfully distracted man named Harvey Leland, promised the radiator worked if you swore at it. The lease was short. The walls were longer. I painted them a white that pretended to be clean and hung a sign, "Quick Fix Roaming Tech, Walk-ins Welcome." I printed it at a copy center where the clerk, Chase McDermott, wore a flannel shirt and a look of permanent curiosity. "You need a bookkeeper yet?" he asked. I did not, but I needed someone who knew the difference between expense and investment, so I said, "Maybe soon." The walk-ins came like weather, sporadic, then sudden, then everywhere you look. They brought stories with a cracked glass, a bartender in River West who broke her phone rescuing a raccoon, a contractor who dropped a tablet into wet cement and watched it sink like a dream, a teacher who kept every parent contact number in a device that fell off the roof of his car and lived to text about it. I fixed what I could, explained what I couldn't, and started saying no to free advice requests that arrived at 11:43 p.m. Mornings, I'd sweep the floor like I was erasing yesterday's mistakes. The radiator listened with indifference. Growth is a polite word for panic. I reached the point where I couldn't answer every call and still sleep enough to keep my hands steady. I put up a hand-lettered sign in the window, "Help wanted, patience required." 2 days later, A recent tech school grad named Ivy Lang walked in with a resume smudged by winter gloves and eyes that tracked like a programmer's. She took apart a dead phone on the counter while telling me about farm towns, solder burns, and learning to love precision. When she looked up, I hired her. The relief in my shoulders was a sound. Ivy worked with clean focus, and customers trusted her the way jumpers trust a measured rope. She caught errors before they hatched and convinced me to switch suppliers after a shipment of third-rate screens warped like funhouse mirrors. We began to think like a team, routines for intake, scripts for bad news, spare jokes for the awkward wait. Chase, who had started dropping by with coffee and questions, offered to set up quarterly filings in exchange for me fixing his ancient laptop he refused to quit. He taught me what a margin actually was, and why cash flow is the kind of truth you can't charm. I slept a little better knowing the math could stand on its own feet. Not everyone welcomed us. A man named Ralph Donnelly ran a repair kiosk inside the mall and took exception to my flyer on the bulletin board. He stormed in, red in the face, and announced I was undercutting honest businessmen like him. I explained I was pricing my value, not my fear. He said he'd tell everyone I used cheap parts. I smiled the way you smile at a neighbor's dog that barks from behind a fence and never jumps. Then I called my supplier, doubled down on quality, and posted my sourcing policy where anyone could read it. The next week, Ralph posted a rant on a local forum under a username that wasn't clever. Sabrina, the courier who'd first believed in me, answered him with a paragraph that made strangers clap. Community is a lever you don't notice until it moves something heavy. In October, a cyclist slid on wet leaves and took down our plate glass. He was more startled than hurt. We swept together in the twilight, while Ivy taped cardboard over the frame. A passing stranger named Dallas Keegan set down a bag of takeout and helped us hold the new pane in place when it arrived, asking nothing except the chance to warm his hands near the misbehaving radiator. I paid the glazier and added insurance to Chase's list with a sinking feeling that was, it turned out, Prudence wearing a mask. With the storefront came something else, the ability to see who we were becoming. A young dad named Eric Salazar came in with a tablet clutched like a life preserver and a toddler who wanted to touch every screw. Eric told me he was trying to pass a certification to move from third shift to days. We fixed the tablet. The toddler left with a sticker of a fox. 2 weeks later, Eric came back with a grin that rearranged the room. He'd passed. He brought cookies from the bakery downstairs, and when he left I realized I was crying in the quiet, not because of cookies, but because the ledger was starting to track something that looked like dignity. Mine, his, ours. I knew the past hadn't finished with me. It rarely does. But each day I proved a theorem I'd written in my notebook back in Ohio. Work is a language, and I'd learned to conjugate it differently from the people who taught me to fear verbs. I kept my head down and my prices fair. I kept saying no to the late-night ghosts who wanted impossible fixes for free. I kept a space in the back of my mind for the call I suspected would come eventually, the one with a familiar number, the one that would ask me to translate a kind of need I remembered too well. Until then, I tightened every screw I could reach and practiced not shaking. The pivot to steadier work arrived on the back of a dented aluminum clipboard. A logistics coordinator named Maya Sheridan from a local courier company walked in and asked if we did bulk service calls. I looked at Ivy. Ivy looked at me. "We do now," I said. By the end of the week we had a contract to service 24 devices for fleet ops, with surge rates during blizzards and festival weekends. It wasn't glamorous, but it was oxygen. I built a spreadsheet that made me feel like a conductor, and for the first time since leaving the warehouse, I exhaled without counting. With steadier days came room for maintenance of a different kind. I booked 3 sessions with a counselor named Colin Evers at a clinic that charged on a sliding scale. I told him about jars and rags and names that stick to your ribs. He told me about boundaries like fences you build without apology. He didn't try to fix my parents with a sentence, which made me trust him. I left his office with the same backpack but a slightly different posture, like I'd adjusted the strap across a sore shoulder. In the evenings, when North Avenue glowed and the bakery smell drifted up to our sign, I'd lock the door and sit on the floor. I'd think about the day I would expand, hire 2 more techs, move into a space not defined by apologies to radiators. I'd picture the boy who used to polish the church's card tables until he could see his disappointed face in them. I wanted to find that kid and tell him he wasn't lazy, He was lapping people in a race no one else could see. But the past has no mailbox. You send what you can forward. I breathe, remember, and keep describing the scene in simple, grounded detail, letting the moment linger the way late light lingers on a quiet American street. I breathe, remember, and keep describing the scene in simple, grounded detail, letting the moment linger the way late light lingers on a quiet American street. I breathe, remember, and keep describing the scene in simple, grounded detail, letting the moment linger the way late light lingers on a quiet American street. Success did not arrive with a ribbon, it arrived with a list and a lease. When the hairline cracks of our first shop began to look like lines on a skilled hand, I signed for a second location closer to the business district, a sunlit wedge under a mural of cranes and lake gulls. The new landlord, Nicole Farley, wore boots that meant business and a grin that meant welcome. She'd lost a brother to a factory accident, she told me as we shook hands, and she cared about who worked where and why. I liked her right away, which made me double-check the contract. I liked it too. We rebranded without losing ourselves. Quick Fix Roaming Tech had sounded like a favor. Lake Effect Devices sounded like we could handle winter. Ivy designed a logo that would still look good after a snowstorm. Chase set up the new books and coached me through the inventory model like a patient gym trainer. 2 new hires joined, Oliver Nunez, fresh from a community college program with forearms like rope, and Janelle Fisk, who could resolder a microconnector while listening to a customer tell the story of a hard year. I held the first staff meeting with a pot of coffee and an index card that said 1. Do right by the customer, 2. Do right by each other, 3. Go home proud. The city began to remember we existed. A bank officer named Latasha Bloom stopped by with flyers for a small business grant and left her card with a post-it note that said, "Apply." Seriously. I hate forms, but I love momentum, so I applied between appointments and fixed a cracked tablet belonging to a bar owner named Grant Wicker, who traded us free space for a pop-up, tech triage, night during the playoff run. People brought us their handheld embarrassments, and we brought them back from the brink, while the Brewers threatened to make October interesting. We invested in a van that made our roaming service look like a promise instead of a rumor. Owen Tripp, a mechanic with a sleeve of tattoos that told the story I didn't ask him to narrate, inspected the van and taught me to hear the difference between an honest rattle and a future bill. I wrapped it with our name and a phone number big enough to read from across a mis-parked SUV. When I drove it the first time, a teenager waved, and I waved back like I was a parade of one. The days stacked, then the months. We handled a snowstorm that shut down 3 interstates, and didn't lose a single day to recovery. We underpromised and over-delivered so often I worried we'd lose the hungry edge, but hunger, I've learned, travels with you. On Fridays I bought pizza for the crew and added a line item to the budget called gratitude. We celebrated the tiny wins, a 5-star review from someone who had never liked anything, a successful repair on a device so old it should have had a museum tag, a customer named Rhiannon Dale who brought us a dozen cupcakes to mark 1 year since we'd rescued her thesis notes from a fried tablet. Janelle cried, Oliver pretended he didn't. Ivy rolled her eyes and kept the photo. I kept writing letters I'd never send. I told the kid version of me about bank accounts and contracts and team text threads where people said, "Got you," and meant it. I told him that he had been right to keep notes and margins, that margins can become headlines. And I told him the jar on top of the fridge was a myth built to hide theft. I told him we had, finally, bought our own safe. A feature in a neighborhood newsletter led to a segment on morning radio. The host, Trevor Bix, had me on for 10 minutes to talk about device hygiene and avoiding scams. He asked where I'd learned my work ethic. I said, Ohio, which was true, and also a way to be specific without naming people who didn't deserve the air. After the show, bookings rose. So did the emails from strangers asking for advice on starting out. I answered as many as I could without turning into a free hotline. I remembered Derek's anchors on his tie and smiled. Winter layered the city in white, then ice, then slush that makes you doubt your choices. We kept going. Fleet Ops expanded their contract. Another logistics outfit, Northline Courier, signed with us after their ops manager, Lydia Pruitt, got tired of meeting dudes who talked down to her and upcharged. We did neither. We fixed what was broken, we admitted what wasn't, and we showed up when we said we would. Sometimes the secret is not a secret at all. With growth came paperwork that looked like a stack of small mountains. I hired an attorney named Priya Venkataraman to read what I could not pretend to understand and to translate it into obligations I could meet. She explained liability waivers like a calm weather report and reviewed vendor contracts with a pen that clicked only when necessary. A consultant named Wendy Koch walked us through HR basics, which turned out to be less about forms and more about conversations. Boundaries, feedback, raises that reflect reality and not vibes. These were repairs, too. I moved out of the room above the bakery into a one-bedroom near the lake with a window that framed the kind of blue that forgives. The realtor, Caleb Morton, congratulated me by stabbing the air with a key I'd earned with invoices and restraint. The first night there, I lay on a rug I couldn't afford 6 months earlier and listened to the city breathe through the vents. It felt like living in the answer to a question I'd been asking since I was 14. On a Saturday in May we hosted a free clinic for high school seniors who needed their devices tuned before graduation. A teacher named Alicia Pritchard organized the line and kept spirits high with jokes about tassels. Watching Oliver teach a kid how to back up her photos while Ivy replaced the cracked screen in 8 graceful minutes, I understood pride the way welders understand heat. I put my name on the donation sign because it mattered for students to see a local business say, "We see you." And if I'm honest, because the 14-year-old in my chest wanted to stand in a room and not be invisible. I did not think about my parents much, not because I had forgiven them, but because forgiveness is not an app you install, it's a system update that takes a restart you don't always have time for. Still, certain words could yank a cable in my head, lazy team. I'd hear them in a customer's mouth and feel an old draft through a new window. I'd steady myself on the counter and remind myself what Dr. Evers said about weather and houses. Let the storm pass without opening every door. And then the email came, written at 1:12 a.m., from an address that looked like a borrowed coat. It was 3 lines and a phone number. It was from my sister's old friend, Kayla Boone, who had found me the way people do. She wrote, "Mom and Dad are in trouble. They might lose the house. They asked if I had your number. I didn't. I'm sorry." She added, in a postscript that tightened the old fist in my stomach, "They asked me to tell you they're proud of you." Pride, from them, read like a coupon with fine print. I stared at the screen until the city outside decided it was morning. The email sat in my inbox like a stone in a shoe. I could ignore it and limp, or stop and deal with it. I called the number at noon, because noon makes everyone honest. A woman picked up on the second ring and said my name like a question. She introduced herself as my sister's neighbor from back home, and then passed the phone to someone I hadn't heard in years. My sister's voice was older in the best and worst ways. She told me the house was months behind on the mortgage, that the utilities were a game of musical chairs, that the pantry had more dust than food. She said our parents wanted to talk. I stared at the lake out my office window until the whitecaps looked like crumpled receipts. I said I'd drive down Saturday. Ohio in late summer wears heat like a dare. The yard on Darnell Street was the same hard patchwork, but the porch paint had given up. A hand-lettered notice hung crooked on the door. The neighbor across the street, a retired mail carrier named Donna Reese, called hello and asked whether I wanted sweet tea. I said yes, because in Dayton saying no to sweet tea starts fights. We stood on her stoop and she filled me in. The jobs that slipped away, the refinance that never quite happened, the way my parents still held court in the garage like royalty whose subjects had moved. Donna shook her head. "They always told people you were off doing big things," she said. Her tone made big sound like suspicious luggage. I thanked her and crossed the street. Inside, the house smelled like yesterday's grease and a stubborn candle. My sister stood in the kitchen, taller than the last time I'd seen her, picture of a tired kind of grace. We hugged like people who remember 1,000 small wars and one truce. Our parents appeared from the hallway together, 2 familiar storms advancing. Mom's first words were a compliment shaped like a complaint. "You look healthy." Dad's were an assessment. "Nice watch." I had bought the watch used from a pawn shop as a promise to myself that time now belonged to me. I put my hands in my pockets and asked to sit. We talked numbers. A mortgage officer at a branch on Linden had mailed 3 warnings and a final notice. Interest had compounded the way mold compounds in a damp corner. An auction date had been penciled in by a clerk named Gavin Holt, who had the thankless job of organizing other people's endings. Utilities were in rotating partials. Medical bills bulged like overstuffed drawers. My parents presented it all with the weary outrage of people who believe the universe misfiled their paperwork. Finally, Mom said what they had brought me here to hear. We need help. You're doing so well. Her voice turned my success into spare change. I could feel the old reflex reach for my wallet the way a hand reaches for a hot pan and learns, again, the lesson. In the corner, a calendar from the church showed September circles around a rummage sale. The garage door was open to the heat, and the same folding tables where I'd learned to lift and smile. My chest did that hollow elevator drop, the one you get when a memory takes the stairs two at a time. I asked for a few minutes alone on the porch, and no one argued, which might have been respect or strategy. Outside, the street hummed with the same tired mystery it always had. A kid on a scooter traced a figure 8 in front of the fire hydrant. Donna waved once and went inside to a daytime show where judges pretend to know how hearts work. I called the counselor back in Milwaukee and left a message I didn't need answered so much as heard. Then I called the number on the notice and got a clerk named Russell Pierce, who spoke like he learned to be gentle with bad news. He confirmed the arrears. He confirmed the date. He said there were options, all of them shaped like time we didn't have. I went back in. I said I was willing to help my sister find a rental if the house went. I was willing to pay for a moving truck and a storage unit for a year. I was willing to cover 3 months of medication. I was not willing to hand over a blank check to people who had convinced a 14-year-old that groceries were his duty and childhood his hobby. Silence settled like dust in sunlight. Dad leaned back and did the math in his jaw. Mom blinked the way she did when a sermon didn't land. So you won't save your family? Dad said, choosing the most expensive words. I'm saving the part that lets me sleep at night, I said. I'm saving the part that won't teach your grandkids that debt is a love language. Mom's mouth trembled then tightened. We worked so hard, she said. We gave you everything. The statement landed like a coat thrown over a puddle and called a bridge. You gave me a head start, sure, I said. Into labor, into guilt, into thinking lazy was my name. I'm not going to fund that story to keep running. My sister touched my arm in a small, grateful, guilty way. We began listing practical steps. We wrote phone numbers. We made a stack of documents. When Dad reached across the table toward my keys as if proximity could convert into access, I moved them to my other pocket and kept my voice even. On my way out, the garage caught me. The space heater still hunched in the corner like a dog that never learned its name. The folding tables were bowed from years of pretending to be sturdy. I put my hand on the nearest one and felt the old ache in my wrists rise like a ghost. My mother called after me from the kitchen. You know, if you tried harder back then, maybe we wouldn't be here now. The words snapped into place with eerie familiarity, like a song's chorus after a decade away. I turned to face the empty street because it mattered that I looked at something that did not lie. I'm trying now, I said, not sure if I was talking to them or the boy I used to be. I'm trying exactly hard enough. I breathe, steady, letting the room and the road hold their silence until the words feel earned. I drove back north with the air conditioning turned up, not because the day was hot, but because I needed the white noise to sand down the edges of old echoes. On the interstate near Mommy, a billboard told me to call a number if I wanted to sell my house fast. The idea stuck to me like burrs. I'd read enough about notes and liens to understand the ritual, debt dressed in legal clothes. I thought about buying the paper on their place just to prove I could own the thing that used to own me. By the time I hit the skyway and the lake opened like a silver answer, I'd talked myself out of it. Revenge that required a broker and a notary felt like wearing someone else's suit. I wanted boundaries, not trophies. Back at the shop, my lead tech watched me with the kind of quiet you'd pay for if you could. My bookkeeper set a coffee on the desk and adjusted the cushion in my chair as if the day itself had a knot we could work out. I told them the bare facts. They didn't push. They did what a team does, held steady. The contracts kept coming. A Parks Department IT manager named Nolan Driggs asked about a service agreement for rec centers on the south side. An events organizer, Julie Kerr, wanted device support at a lakefront festival where sand gets into ports and optimism gets into cables. We said yes to both, because saying yes to the city had become our way of saying yes to ourselves. In the evenings I jogged along the lake with a tempo that matched the repairing of a mind. I sorted the boxes in my head into keep, donate, discard. Keep, the discipline that had kept the lights on. Keep, The ledger that measured more than money. Donate. The notion that I owed people who hadn't paid their own debts. Discard. The compulsion to fix people like devices. On a Tuesday, a property manager named Mason Cole showed me a vacant unit 2 floors above our second shop, a corner office with more glass than sense. I'd come to ask about storage, but I stood there and realized I could afford a place to put our name on a door and letters that didn't peel. I signed. Success makes a different kind of noise when it's yours. The new office sounded like staplers in good moods and the laughter of customers who felt seen. A local paper ran a profile with a headline I pretended to hate and secretly loved. A high school invited me to talk to seniors about starting small and staying honest. I went, and I told them the truth a way a kid like me needed to hear. That hustle without boundaries is just running in circles that look like progress from far away. A guidance counselor there, MS. Dalton, pressed my hand in both of hers and said she'd been waiting to hear someone say that with their chest. I kept helping my sister. We found a rental on a bus line near a decent grocery. A landlord named Peter Lutz agreed to a 6-month lease with option to renew, and the place had that rarest of amenities, walls that don't listen to your thoughts. We boxed up childhood into what would fit. We labeled everything in big, cheerful markers so nobody had to guess. We moved her on a Saturday with a borrowed truck from a tool-lending library staffed by a man named Conrad Webb who treated torque wrenches like musical instruments. My sister baked a sheet of brownies in a pan that had survived 3 kitchens. We ate them on the floor and let the new apartment tell us its own small story about second chances. 2 weeks before the auction date, my parents called from a number I didn't recognize. I answered because sometimes progress is simply refusing to be haunted by the unknown. They asked if I'd meet them at a diner off the highway where truckers drink coffee like pennants. I said noon again. Noon is my truce time. The diner had a cracked jukebox and a waitress with a name tag that read Amelia in flaking blue. She called me honey and poured coffee without asking first. My parents arrived together, dressed like they were auditioning for the role of people who have it together. The performance could have fooled a camera. I asked about the auction. Dad said they'd requested a postponement. Mom said she'd prayed. Both looked at me as if I were the clerk of fate. We were thinking, Dad began, and I braced for a sentence that began thinking and ended with my checkbook. You could co-sign a refinance, Mom said, voice sugar over gravel. Just to stabilize things. We pay you back, of course. Of course is the most expensive phrase in American English. I stirred my coffee like it could respond. I set the spoon down. I let the silence do its work. No, I said. I'm not signing anything. I'll cover a moving truck. I'll pay for a storage unit and 3 months of prescriptions. But I won't be a silent partner in a story that names me lazy when I say no and family when I say yes. The waitress set down plates as if shielding us with over-easy eggs. My mother looked past me toward a window where nothing interesting happened. My father went still in the way men sometimes go still when they sense a shift they can't control. We raised you. He tried. We taught you work. He wanted credit accrued on a loan I had already paid back with interest. You taught me to endure, I said. The other parts one learned from people who didn't charge admission. I thought of the warehouse vet who had fed me a sandwich without asking, the clerk with anchors on his tie, the neighbor who offered sweet tea without a ledger attached. Community had carried me farther than blood. That is not a betrayal, it's a map. They left first, chairs scraping like commentary. Amelia topped off my cup and left the check face down. On the way out I asked her name because wearing a tag doesn't mean being seen. She laughed and said, It's on the shirt, sugar. I said I knew, and told her I wanted to use her name right. She squeezed my elbow. In the parking lot a trucker adjusted his mirrors and the afternoon turned the diner windows gold. I stood in that parking lot long enough to memorize how it felt to hold a boundary and not apologize to people who had relied for years on my confusion. On the auction day I was in a city building fixing a row of stubborn tablets for a parks program. The call came through from an unknown Ohio number. I let it ring out. Later, my sister texted, "House gone." She added a heart and a period. The period mattered. It meant an ending that wasn't a cliff. I walked to the lake and let the wind pin my shirt against my ribs and tell me I was still here, still me, still the kid with a notebook, just taller and paid. The long game isn't measured in years so much as in what you refuse to carry from one year to the next. Word got around our hometown that the garage kid had turned into a man with an office, contracts, and a van with his name on it. A cousin tagged me in a photo from a festival. An old coach sent a thumbs-up emoji that looked more like a shrug. A church bulletin printed my business name under a list of successful alumni, as if high school were the institution that had made me. Meanwhile, we kept tuning the machinery of our days. We expanded the training programs so new hires shadowed veterans before touching a customer device. A college junior named Paige Rowland joined as an intern and built an intake checklist so clean it could slice mistakes in half. A retired engineer, Arthur Yates, began volunteering once a week to teach soldering to teens who wanted work that felt like magic you could explain. The city gave us a small business award I accepted in a room with bad acoustics and good intentions. A council member named Selena Park shook my hand and said she used our shop for her kid's Chromebook. I smiled for the photo and thought about the kid who had once measured his worth in jars on a fridge and miles walked before dawn. At the reception, a banker with earnest posture and a tie the color of patience suggested we consider buying our building. I wrote his name on a napkin and later, after the noise faded, I called. 2 months and a stack of signatures later, we closed. I stood in the empty upstairs unit we'd once borrowed for storage and held a key that didn't ask my past for permission. Ownership felt less like arrival than like a promise not to leave the room when things got complicated. Complicated arrived one Tuesday afternoon when the front desk buzzed. My assistant said 2 visitors were here without an appointment, and used the tone reserved for people who come carrying storms. I told her I had 10 minutes. She gave me a look that translated to 5. I said okay. Boundaries evolve, storms recur. My parents came into the office looking smaller and louder at once. Time had leaned on them. They sat in the conference chairs that had witnessed vendor negotiations and staff reviews and 100 small mercies. Mom opened with a sigh shaped like a prayer. Dad opened with a layup. We're in a bind. They told me about debts that had multiplied like rabbits, about an apartment with thin walls and a landlord named Rita Collins who insisted on rent being not a concept but a transaction. They had a plan. Their plan involved me. We thought. Mom began, setting a folder on the table as if it were Exhibit A and the jury had nowhere else to be. That you could float us for a few months. Just until things stabilize. You've got all this. She gestured to the glass, the view, the plants my assistant kept alive with discipline. And we just need a little push. The folder contained printouts that looked official and budgets that looked like wishes. My name had been penciled into every solution like a magic word. I listened because listening is free and because the kid in me still sometimes believes acceptance can be earned by being useful. I asked clarifying questions the way my attorney taught me, direct, specific, non-judgmental. I watched their answers slide off the page. When the explanation started repeating, I held up a hand. The room found its quiet. Outside, lake light climbed the walls like a slow rescue. Do you remember? I said, keeping my voice even. What you used to say when I came home from my paper route and the jar on the fridge was light? My mother blinked. My father frowned like a man reading a map held upside down. The words came back to me with the clarity of a doorbell. You'd say, you're just not trying hard enough. I let the sentence sit between us like a box I was not going to carry anymore. My father scoffed. That was different. It was always the same, I said. You had a need and you named my effort the problem. I leaned back so I could see both of them and also the city beyond them, which had taught me another language for need. Here's my offer, I said. I'll pay for financial counseling sessions with a reputable nonprofit here in town. I'll cover the first month of any payment plan they set up with your creditors, up to a fixed dollar amount. I'll buy you groceries today and a bus pass for 3 months. That's it. No loans. No co-signing. No secret bailouts. If you want different results, try different work. Try the kind that doesn't draft me without consent. My mother's lips thinned. My father's jaw clicked. You're being cruel, he said. I'm being clear, I answered. Cruelty was calling a kid lazy while cashing his tips to keep the lights on, and then telling him it was for his own good. I could feel my hands steadying on the arms of the chair in a way that told a story better than any speech. Silence widened. The clock on the wall refused to hurry or slow. Somewhere down the hall a customer laughed, which felt like a benediction. They stood. They adjusted anger like a coat. They said things meant to undo me. They didn't. My assistant knocked and asked if I needed anything. I said I was fine. My parents left with a scrape of chair legs and an echo of old narratives trying and failing to resurrect themselves. I sat alone for a long minute. Then I called a counselor at the nonprofit I'd mentioned. Her name was Dana Huff, and booked 2 slots in their next budgeting workshop under my parents' initials in case Pride needed privacy. I scheduled a grocery delivery to the address my sister had given me. I texted her after. Help offered, boundary held. She sent back a heart, no period this time. Growth. That night I walked home past the mural of cranes and gulls. The air smelled like rain deciding. I unlocked the door to a place with lights I paid for, set down a key I had earned, and let a quiet settle that felt like something new, not triumph, not relief, but the measured calm of a person who has stopped auditioning for approval that always had terms and penalties. I set an alarm for morning. I checked a list for the free clinic we were hosting next week at the library. I wrote a note to remind myself to order more stickers for kids who liked foxes. Karma did not arrive with trumpets. It arrived when I declined to carry a bill that wasn't mine and watched a different balance sheet light up. The one where my crew got raises that matched their excellence, where a teenager left our shop with a repaired laptop and a list of internships, where my sister slept in a place with walls that minded their business. And when someone tells me these days that success changed me, I say yes. That's the point. Change is the late payment you owe the kid you were, the one who worked at 14 and was called lazy. I'm still paying him back, on time, with interest, and here's the part that makes the numbers sing. He's finally keeping the receipts.